Thank you, sir, and thank you for the introduction. As you've heard, I head up the City of London Police Economic Crime Directorate. One of my units is the Overseas Anti-Corruption Unit, and as you've heard also, that I've got my DCI here today, Sanjay. And if you've got any specific questions, then please do approach us after the session today and ask those hard, searching questions that perhaps we may not feel as open to answer in this public forum. I've got some history in this area, because back in 2006, when I was myself, like Sanjay at DCI, I had the pleasure, and I do call it pleasure, to work with the Department for International Development to establish the unit. So I negotiated with some very senior members of government to find a pocket of money to take this piece of work forward, because we thought at the time it was important, and here we are 7 years down the line, it now is important to business, and you've heard how Commissioner Leppard has framed the importance of corruption to the UK economy. One of my roles during the first year of that unit was to travel to Paris, which was a great pleasure, but until I landed there, because I had to go to the OECD and effectively be the whipping boy for the UK government, because at the time we had a very poor reputation. Certainly the Americans, the French were very unhappy about the way we were tackling bribery and corruption, and that needed to change. And it's a great pleasure for me to be back here many years later, looking at what we've achieved. I think at the time, well, we didn't have a bribery offence. We had some old-style corruption legislation, and we weren't really using that to great effect. But here we are, 7 years on, we've made real great progress, but there is still a great deal to do. Now, since my section is on investigating bribery, I probably should start by framing the context of how that works in the UK. You've heard from Commissioner Leppard about the involvement of the National Crime Agency. Well, actually, the Serious Fraud Office are a big player in this, and they're our close partner. We provide the muscle to their brains, so when they effect search warrants, when they need to arrest people, we do that on their behalf. But they are the national lead agency for bribery and corruption, and we also share part of the responsibility with this Serious and Organised Crime Agency, which will become in October the National Crime Agency. The latter, SOCA, deals with the intelligence piece, and between ourselves and the Serious Fraud Office, we deal with the hard grind of investigation. And it is a hard grind because some of these investigations take us overseas, as you can imagine, but we're also dealing with some very bright and effective and capable people. And they take some investigating, but we get there. We've had 28 successful prosecutions so far, and there will be many more in the future. But it isn't just about enforcement, and I'll come to that soon. We welcome the role of the National Crime Agency also, because there really does need to be some coordination in this field. You have various government departments, be it the Department for Business, the Ministry of Justice, the Home Office, interested in this world, and somebody needs to pull all that together. At the moment, my teams are working with the National Crime Agency in its shadow format to deal with pension liberation fraud. You may well have read about that in the paper, to deal with share purchase fraud, and that's working really well. And I think with their coordination role and our expertise, Sanjay's expertise and her team, we can actually make a difference. You heard from Howard and also the Commissioner about the impact of corruption. This is where I do my passionate bit, and forgive me and indulge me for doing that. I've got my own perspective about corruption, not just because of the negotiations that I had with the Department for International Development back in 2006. Because 2 years after setting up the unit, I was called up as an Army reservist to serve in Afghanistan. And I saw at first hand just what corruption means and how debilitating it is for an economy. And what an eye-opener that was. I saw at first hand medical supplies provided by the coalition's forces being taken by local tribal leaders and then sold on immediately for profit, whilst children were lay dying at the roadside. And I don't say that for effect. What I saw was quite shocking. What I also saw were people who never invested in the future. Because why start up a shop? Why build anything when you think that your competitor is going to pay off a local official simply to take you down, and all of that hard work evaporates in an instant? And so I'm passionate as a cop about corruption. It's our core business. Any crime should be our core business, and I think historically we've probably shied away from this arena and we very much need to make sure this is core business for policing across the board. Now, looking at the standard itself, lots of private firms out there. I think we've got Monty, Raphael following me from Peters & Peters, who will talk about the private perspective. It's a healthy thing that we have law practices and we have the big five involved in this area to train companies. But we in the police have our role to play, and I think we can add something very useful in terms of the dimension of training. And that's the one about our core role, which is being nosy and challenging and asking some difficult questions. And that's the input that we've had to the standard. You know, it's cultural. Often I'll meet people in social situations, and before I know it, I've asked them about 100 questions, and they say, "Whoa, wait a minute. It's not an interrogation, is it?" And we do that by default in many ways. But actually, if you're trying to implement the standard, that's a really good place to be. And that's what we need members of companies, members of government to do when they're implementing the standard, to see behind what they see on the page and to ask some really searching questions. Because I mentioned it before, didn't I, about the abilities and the connivance and cunning of some of the people that we have to deal with. You really do have to ask some searching questions and be tenacious. When I did my senior investigators course up in Manchester, my trainer at the time said, "Ollie, all you have to do is apply the ABC approach." And I was thinking, oh, what's that? ABC, accept nothing, believe no one, check everything. And if you apply that in the sphere of a standard, actually it's a really good approach to use. Now, in terms of the nuts and bolts, Commissioner Leppard has talked about the strategy, why we need to do this, and it's my job and Sanjay's job to translate that into investigation and what happens on the ground. The most common question we are asked is about facilitation payments. In fact, I was at an event 2 days ago, Monty was there as well, where the head of the Serious Fraud Office, David Green, was asked the very same question. Slightly interesting in that our answers are different, but not wrong. David's approach at Serious Fraud Office is very much about prosecution and setting the ethical standard. We're cops, and you've heard from Mr. Leppard, we're about stopping the problem in whichever way is the most appropriate. So here's an example for you to hopefully translate the way that we deal with facilitation payments. We're in the City of London, a beautiful built environment, but you will see lots of people who walk out here today drop litter and cigarette ends. Now, de facto, dropping a cigarette end is an offence. I'm going to have to read this because it's a long time since I've been on the streets, but it is now an offence under the Clean Neighbourhoods and Environment Act 2005. When I was last on the street, it was the Environment Act 1990. But it's an offence, and if one of our officers sees that happening, you know, probably their most common response would be to approach the person, ask them to pick it up, and then educate them, say why it's an offence to drop litter, and say what the impact is on the people who live and work in the city. It's ruining them, it's ruining their experience, and it's degrading their built environment. However, if one of my officers sees a restaurant owner tip out a big bucket of industrial waste, when actually what they should be doing is employing a company to collect that, they absolutely get challenged on that and they'll get prosecuted. And it won't just be a £30 fine, it will be taken to court. And if you use that as an example of a single offence but lots of different ways to tackle it, I think I've hopefully translated Mr. Leppard's big picture about where we step over the line, where companies step over the line and have to be dealt with. I'm now going to talk about the cultural journey that companies need to go on and why the standard is so important. The training regime is ultimately a document, and you will be trained to the standard of that document. But if any company thinks that that is the solution to the problem, they're mistaken. It needs to be a cultural change. Senior management need to believe it, and they need to be passionate about this area. I fully accept, and this is the reality pill here, that there will be many members of companies who don't actually buy this, particularly in the sales world where they're being pushed hard all the time to get that sale, and they'll see corruption and bribery as something that needs to be overcome in order to get the business done. But a good example of how we can actually tackle it head on and make a difference is seatbelt legislation. It came in 1983, and I remember vividly being in the car with my grandparents who thought it was crazy because they got their licences probably in the 1930s and didn't see why it was important to wear seatbelts. And how long did it take before society said, actually, it's unacceptable not to wear a seatbelt? And you know you've won the argument, and I've been there, when your own children are saying to you when you get in the car, oh, Dad, you haven't got your seatbelt on. That's happened to me. But we can win that cultural change so that in the future, corruption, like the seatbelt issue, like dropping litter, becomes unacceptable. And it saves lives, doesn't it? It's not just about plunk click every trip. We remember that, don't we, from the advertising campaign. It saves lives. And corruption ultimately saves lives because those kids back in Afghanistan who didn't get those medical supplies didn't do so because of corruption, not for anything else. Now, we're the City of London Police. We are the lead force for economic crime. We're driving the policing response to corruption, but we're not the only people here. There are 43 forces up and down the country in England and Wales, now the combined police force of Scotland, Northern Ireland. In addition, all of policing has a responsibility here. In fact, as Sanjay will well know, a really good case taken on recently by Avon Somerset Police into the sale of fake bomb disposal devices. You've probably read about that in the papers. There are other forces out there dealing with this issue, and quite rightly they should. And as I said at the start, this is core business. We will always need, ultimately, to have an enforcement response, and we're very proud of our success because before we started in this arena, there simply weren't any prosecutions. We've now had 28, and they've made a difference. But using that road safety analogy again, the City of London Police and our involvement in corruption, we will not be judged by the number of prosecutions that we effectively deliver. We will be judged by the level of corruption within British business. That's the approach we adopt in terms of road safety. I use that analogy again. We judge our success by the number and the fall in the number of people being killed or seriously injured on the streets of the city, not by the number of tickets we give out. I'm really proud to have been involved in this area of policing because it's new, it's innovative, and it's making a difference. And historically, if I may comment on the benefit of being involved in anti-corruption, Great Britain was the leader. People came to this country because we had a very strong ethical code. It was our unique selling position, and that's why the city is so successful. If we take a firm line on bribery and corruption, it's good for business. I really look forward to seeing how the standard develops. It's great for governance, it's great for professionalism, and I think ultimately it will be great for business. Thank you.